The first time I saw Ethan standing at my doorstep, I wasn't sure whether to feel surprised or concerned. It had been years since I last saw him. My nephew, the boy who used to spend summers here, chasing fireflies in my garden and sneaking cookies from the kitchen when he thought I wasn't looking. But now, standing before me at 27, he looked nothing like the carefree child I remembered. His shoulders were hunched under the weight of a worn-out backpack, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes carried a heaviness that didn't belong on someone so young. "Ethan?" I asked, my voice laced with confusion. "Hey, Aunt Lily," he said, his lips curving into a faint, almost apologetic smile. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, still processing his sudden appearance. My house, nestled at the edge of a quiet coastal town, wasn't exactly the kind of place people stumbled upon by accident. You had to mean to come here. And Ethan's presence, unannounced and unexpected, meant something was wrong. He dropped his bag by the door and stood awkwardly in the living room, as if he didn't quite know what to do with himself. I noticed how thin he'd become, how his clothes hung loosely on him. He looked like someone who'd been running from something, or maybe someone who was just lost. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I gestured toward the couch. "Sit down. I'll make some tea." As I moved to the kitchen, my mind raced with questions. Why was he here? What had happened? The Ethan I remembered was always full of life, always moving forward with big dreams and even bigger plans. But the man sitting in my living room now seemed like a shadow of that boy. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, he was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the ocean in the distance. I set the mugs down on the coffee table and took a seat across from him. "Talk to me, Ethan," I said gently. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "It's a lot," he said finally. "I've been trying to figure things out, but nothing's working. I needed to get away." "From what?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and vulnerability. "Everything." I didn't push him for details. Not yet. Instead, I told him he could stay as long as he needed, that this house would always be a safe place for him. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as if the weight he was carrying had eased, even if just a little. Over the next few days, Ethan settled into the guest room at the end of the hall. He didn't say much about why he'd come or what he was running from, but I could see the cracks in his armor. He spent hours sitting on the porch staring at the waves, his thoughts a million miles away. At night, I'd hear him pacing in his room, the floorboards creaking under his restless steps. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, I found him sitting on the porch steps, a notebook open on his lap. He was scribbling furiously, his pen moving across the page with an urgency that made me hesitate to interrupt. But then he noticed me and stopped, closing the notebook quickly. "Sorry," he said, tucking it under his arm. "I didn't mean to take over your porch." "You're not taking over anything," I said, sitting down beside him. "What are you writing?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the notebook. "Just thoughts. It helps sometimes." I nodded, understanding that he wasn't ready to share more. "The ocean has a way of bringing clarity," I said, glancing out at the waves. "That's why I moved here, you know. After your uncle passed, I needed a place to think, to heal." Ethan looked at me, his expression softening. "I didn't know that." "There's a lot you don't know," I said with a small laugh. "But that's okay. We all have our stories." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't know if I can fix mine." "You don't have to fix it all at once," I told him. "Sometimes it's enough just to take the next step." He didn't respond, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. After a while he stood up and said, "Thanks, Aunt Lily, for letting me stay." "Always," I said. "Your family." That night as I lay in bed I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. There was so much he wasn't saying, so much he was holding back. I wanted to help him, but I knew I couldn't force him to open up. All I could do was be there, to give him the space and time he needed to find his way. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. He looked better, still tired, but not as weighed down as before. "Morning," he said, handing me a cup. "Morning," I replied, taking a sip. "You sleep okay?" Better than I have in a while, he admitted. We sat at the table in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes with family. After a while he said, I was thinking, maybe I could help out around here. Do some repairs. Maybe fix that fence out back. You don't have to do that, I said. I know, he said. But I want to. I need to keep busy. I smiled, grateful for the small step forward. All right. The fence it is. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to open up, little by little. He told me about the job he'd lost, the relationship that had fallen apart, the dreams that now felt so far out of reach. He didn't have all the answers, but he was starting to ask the right questions. And as I watched him rebuild the fence in the backyard piece by piece, I realized that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to rebuild himself too. The days began to take on a rhythm. Ethan would wake early, usually before I even stirred, and I'd find him outside, either working on the fence or sitting on the porch with his notebook. He didn't talk much about what he was writing, but I could tell it was important to him. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring off into the distance, his pen hovering over the page, his thoughts somewhere far away. I didn't press him. Whatever he was working through, it was his process, and I knew better than to interrupt it. One morning, as I was watering the small herb garden by the side of the house, Ethan came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. The fence is done, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. I looked up, surprised. Already? Yeah, it wasn't as bad as it looked. Just needed some new boards and a little reinforcement. I followed him around to the back of the house to inspect his work. The fence, which had been sagging and weather-worn for years, now stood straight and sturdy. He'd even painted it, the fresh white paint gleaming in the sunlight. It looks amazing, I said, genuinely impressed. You did a great job. Ethan shrugged, but I could tell he was pleased. It felt good to do something with my hands, you know? Something tangible. I nodded, understanding what he meant. There's a lot to be said for that. Sometimes when life feels out of control, it helps to focus on the things you can fix. He looked at me for a moment, as if weighing my words, then nodded. Yeah, I think you're right. That afternoon we sat on the porch together, sipping iced tea and watching the waves roll in. The sun was warm on our faces, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan seemed lighter. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him, and let out a contented sigh. This place, he said, gesturing toward the ocean. It's peaceful. I can see why you moved here. It saved me, I admitted. After your uncle passed, I didn't know how to move forward. Everything reminded me of him. The house, the city, even the people. I needed a fresh start. And this was it? This was it, I said with a smile. It wasn't easy at first. I felt so alone. But over time, I started to find myself again. I started painting, gardening, just little things to keep my hands busy. And eventually it got easier. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, I guess I'm trying to do the same thing. Start over. You're in the right place for it, I said. This house has a way of healing people. He glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe it's you, Aunt Lily. Maybe you're the one doing the healing. I laughed, shaking my head. I don't know about that. But I'm glad you're here, Ethan. You've brought life back into this house. His smile grew, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the boy he used to be, the one who used to chase fireflies and laugh until his sides hurt. It was a fleeting moment, but it gave me hope. That evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan hesitated by the sink, a dish towel in his hand. Aunt Lily, he said, his voice tentative. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, drying my hands on a towel. Do you ever regret anything? Like choices you made or things you didn't do? The question caught me off guard. I thought for a moment before answering. I think everyone has regrets, I said finally. But I try not to dwell on them. Life is too short to live in the past. He nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. I feel like I've made so many mistakes, he admitted. Like I've wasted so much time. Ethan, I said gently, you're 27. You have your whole life ahead of you. Mistakes don't define you, they teach you. And as long as you're still breathing, it's never too late to start over. He looked at me, his expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I hope you're right." "I am," I said firmly. "Trust me, Ethan. I've been where you are. And if I can find my way through it, so can you." Over the next few days, Ethan seemed to take my words to heart. He started to open up more, sharing bits and pieces of his life that he'd been holding back. He told me about the job he'd lost, the relationship that had ended, and the dreams that now felt so out of reach. It wasn't easy for him to talk about, but I could see the relief in his eyes as he let it out. One evening, as we were sitting by the fire, he pulled out his notebook and handed it to me. "I want you to read this," he said, his voice hesitant. "It's personal, but I think I'm ready to share it." I took the notebook, feeling the weight of his trust. As I flipped through the pages, I was struck by the raw honesty of his words. He'd poured his heart onto those pages, capturing his pain, his fears, and his hopes with a vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "Ethan," I said, looking up at him, "this is incredible. You have a gift." He shook his head. "It's just thoughts. Nothing special." "It is special," I insisted. "You have a way with words, a way of capturing emotions that most people can't. You should do something with this." "Like what?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Right," I said simply. "Share your story. You never know who might need to hear it." He didn't respond right away, but I could see the idea taking root in his mind. For the first time since he'd arrived, I saw a spark of possibility in his eyes, a glimmer of hope. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's notebook. His words had moved me in a way I hadn't expected. They were raw and unpolished, but they were real. And I knew deep down that they had the power to help him heal, not just him, but maybe others as well. The next morning, as we sat on the porch sipping our coffee, I said, "Ethan, I've been thinking about your writing." "Oh," he said, raising an eyebrow. "I think you should keep going," I said. "Write every day, even if it's just for yourself. Let it be your way of working through things." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a try." And with that, something shifted. Ethan began to write, not just in his notebook but on his laptop, on scraps of paper, on anything he could find. He wrote about his past, his present, and the future he was starting to imagine for himself. And as he wrote, I could see the healing begin to take place. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you need. The days grew longer as winter began to loosen its grip on the coastline. The air carried the first hints of spring, soft and cool. And the garden outside my house started to show signs of life again. Ethan's routine became a familiar rhythm. Mornings on the porch with his notebook. Afternoons spent fixing little things around the house or walking along the shore. And evenings by the fire, where we'd talk about everything and nothing. It was peaceful. Yet I could sense something shifting in him, like a tide beginning to turn. One afternoon, I found him in the garden, crouched by the flower beds with a small trowel in hand. He looked up when he heard me approach, brushing dirt off his hands. "Thought I'd help out a bit," he said, nodding toward the garden. It looked like it needed some attention. I smiled. "It does. I've been neglecting it lately." "Well," he said, standing up and stretching, "it's kind of therapeutic. Digging in the dirt, planting things. Feels grounding." I watched him for a moment, noticing the way the sunlight caught the edges of his face. He looked more at ease than he had in weeks, like the weight he'd been carrying was starting to lift, even if only slightly. "You're a natural," I said, teasing. "Maybe you missed your calling as a gardener." He laughed, a sound that was becoming less rare these days. "I don't know about that. But it's nice to do something real, you know? Something you can see grow." I nodded, understanding what he meant. It's a good reminder, isn't it? That even when things seem dormant, life finds a way to come back. He looked down at the soil, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess it does." Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, Ethan surprised me by pulling out his laptop. He hesitated for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. "I've been working on something," he said. "It's not finished, but I want you to read it." I took the laptop, feeling a mix of curiosity and pride. As I began to read, I realized it wasn't just a collection of thoughts or journal entries. It was a story, his story. He'd taken the pieces of his life, the struggles and heartbreaks, and woven them into something raw and powerful. The writing was honest and unflinching, capturing the pain of losing his job, the loneliness of his breakup, and the sense of failure that had driven him here. But beneath it all, there was also a thread of hope, a quiet determination to find his way back. "Ethan," I said when I finally looked up, "this is incredible." He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just a draft," he said quickly. "I'm still figuring it out." "It doesn't matter," I said firmly. "This is real. It's honest. And it's going to resonate with people." "You really think so?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I know so," I said. "You have a gift, Ethan. Don't let fear hold you back." He didn't respond right away, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. After a moment he said, "I've been thinking about submitting it somewhere. Maybe to a magazine or an online platform, just to see what happens." "You should," I said without hesitation. "The world needs stories like this." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a shot." Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into his writing with a newfound sense of purpose. He spent hours at the kitchen table, typing away on his laptop, occasionally muttering to himself or scribbling notes in the margins of his notebook. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, and all the words he'd been holding back were finally pouring out. One evening, as I was washing dishes, he came into the kitchen, his laptop tucked under his arm. "I did it," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and nerves. "Did what?" I asked, turning to face him. "I submitted the story," he said, "to a few places, just to see if anyone's interested." "That's amazing, Ethan," I said, pulling him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." He laughed, a little embarrassed. "Don't get too excited yet. It's probably a long shot." "Maybe," I said. "But you took the first step. That's what matters." The days that followed were a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Ethan tried to keep himself busy, but I could tell he was anxious, checking his email constantly and second-guessing his decision to submit the story. I did my best to reassure him, reminding him that the act of putting himself out there was already a victory. Then, one morning it happened. I was in the garden pulling weeds when I heard the screen door slam and Ethan's voice calling my name. "Aunt Lily!" he shouted, running toward me with his phone in hand. "They want it. One of the magazines wants to publish my story." I stood up, brushing dirt off my hands. "Ethan, that's incredible." He grinned, his face alight with a joy I hadn't seen in months. "I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, I hoped, but I didn't really think it would happen." "Well, believe it," I said, pulling him into a hug. "You earned this." That evening, we celebrated with a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. As we clinked our glasses, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride, not just for Ethan's accomplishment, but for the journey he'd taken to get here. He'd come to me broken and lost, and now he was starting to find his way again. "This is just the beginning," I said, raising my glass. "To new chapters." "To new chapters," he echoed, his smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. As the night wore on, we talked about his plans for the future. He wanted to keep writing, to explore new stories and ideas. He even mentioned the possibility of moving to a nearby town, where he could be close to the ocean but still have access to a larger community of writers and creatives. "I'm not saying I'm leaving tomorrow," he said quickly, "but it's something I've been thinking about." "I think it's a wonderful idea," I said. "And no matter where you go, this house will always be here for you." "Thanks, Aunt Lily," he said, his voice soft, "for everything. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't come here." "You'd have found your way," I said with certainty, "but I'm glad I could be part of the journey." As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of the waves outside my window, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Ethan had come to me at one of the lowest points in his life, and now he was beginning to rise again. It wasn't just his victory, it was ours. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it. The days after Ethan's story was accepted felt different, as if the house itself had absorbed his newfound energy. There was a lightness to the air, a quiet sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Ethan seemed more alive, more present, and I often caught him humming to himself as he worked on new pieces or tinkered around the house. It was as though the act of being seen, of having his story validated, had reminded him that he still had something to offer the world. One afternoon I found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the ocean. His laptop was open on his lap, but his fingers were still, resting on the keyboard. I brought him a cup of tea and sat down beside him. "Writer's block?" I asked, smiling. "Not exactly," he said, taking the tea with a grateful nod. "I've been thinking about what's next." "That's a good thing, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said, but his tone was hesitant. "It's just, I've spent so much time running from my life, from everything that went wrong. Now that I'm starting to feel like myself again, I'm not sure where to go from here." I sipped my tea, letting the silence stretch between us for a moment. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," I said finally. "Sometimes the next step is just about staying open to what feels right." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking about going back to the city," he admitted. "Not to stay, but just to see it again. To face it." "That's brave," I said. "Do you think you're ready?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think I need to try. There are people I need to talk to, things I need to make peace with." I reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "Whatever you decide, Ethan, you've already come so far. You should be proud of yourself." "Thanks, Aunt Lily," he said, his voice soft. "I wouldn't have made it without you." In the days that followed, Ethan started to make plans for his trip. He booked a train ticket to the city and spent hours on the phone, reconnecting with old friends and colleagues. I could tell he was nervous. There were moments when he'd retreat into himself, his brow furrowed with worry, but there was also a quiet determination in him that I hadn't seen before. The night before he was set to leave, we sat by the fire, the room filled with the comforting crackle of burning wood. Ethan was quiet, staring into the flames, and I could see the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on him. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. He shook his head at first, then paused. "It's just, I'm scared," he admitted. "What if I go back and everything's the same? What if I haven't really changed?" "You have changed," I said firmly. "And even if the city hasn't, you're not the same person who left it. You're stronger now, Ethan. You faced yourself in ways most people never do." He nodded, but his expression was still clouded with doubt. I don't want to mess this up." "You won't," I said. "And even if things don't go the way you hope, you'll figure it out. You always do." The next morning, I drove him to the train station. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ethan was quiet during the drive, his hands fidgeting in his lap, but when we pulled up to the station, he turned to me with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "You don't have to thank me," I said. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything." "Don't forget that you're allowed to come back," I said. "No matter what happens out there, this will always be your home." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I won't forget." I watched him board the train, my heart swelling with both pride and a bittersweet ache. As the train pulled away, I waved, even though I wasn't sure he could see me through the window. And then just like that, he was gone. The house felt quieter without him, almost too quiet. I busied myself with small tasks, tidying the garden, painting the shutters, organizing the shelves, but I couldn't help but miss his presence. He brought so much life back into this place, and without him it felt a little emptier. A week passed before I heard from him. He called late one evening, his voice crackling slightly through the line. "Aunt Lily," he said, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. "I did it. I went back." "And?" I asked, holding my breath. "It was hard," he admitted. "Really hard. But I'm glad I did it. I talked to my old boss, to some friends I hadn't seen in years. I even ran into," he paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. "I even ran into Sarah." Sarah, his ex-girlfriend. He'd mentioned her a few times. always with a mix of regret and longing. But he'd never gone into detail about what had happened between them. How did it go? I asked carefully. It was complicated, he said. But we talked. Really talked. For the first time in a long time. And I think we both got some closure. That's good, I said, my heart aching for him. Closure is important. Yeah, he said, his voice soft. It is. He went on to tell me about the city, how it felt both familiar and strange, like stepping into a version of his life that no longer fit. He talked about the people he'd reconnected with, the places he'd revisited, and the moments that had reminded him of who he used to be. It's weird, he said. I thought going back would make me feel like I was starting over, but it didn't. It just made me realize how far I've come. I'm proud of you, Ethan, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You've come so far. Thanks, Aunt Lily, he said. I couldn't have done it without you. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Ethan was finding his way step by step, and I knew he was going to be okay. He still had a long journey ahead of him, but he wasn't running anymore. He was moving forward, and that was enough. A week after Ethan left, I received a small package sent from the city. I opened it to find a magazine, with Ethan's name listed in the table of contents. His story had finally been published. I couldn't help but smile as I flipped through the pages, reading each line of Ethan's words. Stories I knew had been written with all his heart and honesty. I immediately called Ethan, but the call went to voicemail. I left a short message, telling him I'd received the magazine and how proud I was of him. A part of me worried, wondering if he was doing okay. But I reminded myself that Ethan needed time to continue his own journey. A few days later he called back. His voice sounded brighter, as though some weight had been lifted. Aunt Lily, he said, things are starting to feel better. So the trip helped? I asked, relieved to hear his tone. A lot, Ethan replied. At first it was hard. The city is still the same, but I'm not. I thought I'd feel out of place, but instead, I felt free. I'm not stuck in those old memories anymore. He told me about the people he'd met, the places he'd revisited, and the emotions he'd faced. He spoke about Sarah, not with bitterness or regret, but with a calm acceptance I hadn't heard from him before. We talked, he said. Really talked. It wasn't easy, but it was what we both needed. I think we've both moved on in our own ways. That's good, I said, my voice soft. Closure is important. It is, he agreed. And I think for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to feel like myself again. As he spoke, I could hear the hope in his voice, the quiet confidence that had been missing for so long. Ethan was finding his way step by step, and I couldn't have been prouder. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, holding the magazine in my hands, thinking about how far he'd come. The house felt quieter without him, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This time, it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the knowledge that Ethan was out there, carving a new path for himself. And no matter where that path led, I knew he would always carry a piece of this place, and of me with him. The first time in a long while, I'm starting to feel like I can breathe again. I've been writing more too. Ideas are flowing, and I'm not just writing about the past anymore. I'm writing about what's next. I felt a surge of joy at his words. That's wonderful, Ethan. What are you working on? I've started a new piece, a sort of reflection on everything I've been through. It feels different, like I'm finally ready to share not just the pain, but also the hope, the possibility of what's to come. That's beautiful, I said, my heart swelling with pride. You're really finding your voice. Yeah, I think I am, he said, his tone thoughtful. And I want to keep pushing myself. I've been looking into some writing workshops and communities in the city. I think it could help me connect with other writers and keep growing. Sounds like a great plan, I encouraged. You've got to surround yourself with people who inspire you. He paused, and I could hear the excitement in his voice as he continued. I'm even considering submitting more pieces. I want to get my work out there, to see if I can make a difference with my words. You absolutely can, I said firmly. Your story has the power to touch others who might be going through similar struggles. Ethan chuckled softly, a sound that warmed my heart. It's funny, isn't it? I came here feeling lost. And now I feel like I'm finally finding my way again. Life has a way of surprising us, I replied. Sometimes we have to take a step back to see the bigger picture. As we talked, I could sense the shift in him. A newfound confidence and clarity that hadn't been there before. It was as if he had stepped into a new chapter of his life, one where he was no longer defined by his past but rather empowered by it. I want to come visit you again soon, he said. I miss the ocean and I miss you. I think I need to recharge a bit before diving into all these new changes. I'd love that, I said, my voice warm with affection. You're always welcome here. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of our conversation settle over me. Ethan was on a path of healing and growth, and I felt grateful to have played a part in his journey. In the days that followed, I found myself looking forward to his visit. I began preparing the guest room, making sure everything was just right for when he arrived. I planted new flowers in the garden, hoping to create a welcoming atmosphere filled with color and life. When the day finally came, I stood at the door, excitement bubbling inside me. As the car pulled up, I felt a rush of emotion. Ethan stepped out, looking more vibrant than he had in months. He was wearing a light blue shirt that brought out the color in his eyes, and his smile was bright and genuine. "Aunt Lily," he called, rushing toward me. I opened my arms and he enveloped me in a warm hug. "I'm so glad you're here," I said, stepping back to take him in. "You look amazing." "Thanks. It feels good to be back," he replied, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. "The house looks great. Just a little spring cleaning," I said with a grin. "I wanted to make it feel fresh for your return." Ethan dropped his bag by the door and followed me inside. We settled on the porch, the sun shining down on us, and I could see how at ease he was, as if the worries of the world had melted away. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do next," he said, his voice contemplative. "I want to keep writing, but I also want to explore other forms of creativity, maybe photography or even painting." "That sounds wonderful," I exclaimed. "You have such a keen eye for detail. I can see you capturing the beauty of the world around you." "I think it would help me express myself in new ways," he said, nodding. "I want to embrace all aspects of creativity, not just writing." As the afternoon wore on, we shared stories and laughter, reminiscing about the past while also dreaming about the future. Felt like the old days, but with a new depth and understanding that had come from his journey. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, Ethan pulled out his laptop again. "I want to show you something," he said, excitement dancing in his eyes. I leaned forward, intrigued. He opened a document and began to read aloud. A new piece he had written since his trip back to the city. The words flowed effortlessly, a beautiful blend of reflection and hope, capturing the essence of his journey and the lessons he had learned along the way. When he finished, I was speechless. "Ethan, that was incredible. You've really found your voice." He smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "Thanks, Aunt Lily. It feels good to share it with you." As the fire crackled softly, I realized that this was just the beginning for Ethan. He was no longer the lost boy who had arrived at my doorstep weeks ago. He was a man ready to embrace life, to explore new horizons, and to tell his story in ways he had never imagined. And I knew that whatever path he chose to take, he would always have a home here, filled with love, support, and the promise of new beginnings.